Hello, everyone, and welcome to Espresso Talk today. My name is Hans, and thank you for joining us. We are continuing with the second part of this uncommon conversation about Black-centered psychology. The Espresso Talk Today team is pleased to welcome back Dr. Theopia Jackson, the former president of the Association of Black Psychologists, to discuss this interesting topic. So, grab an espresso and get comfortable for this uncommon episode. Let's listen in.
Hi, it's Robin here. I just want to take a brief minute before we get to Dr. Jackson, because you'll remember that we stopped the previous conversation in part one just as Dr. Jackson was beginning to discuss trauma. Now, that's going to be a really big discussion because trauma is a big issue in the human community, absolutely, but definitely in the Black community. I'm not going to do any spoiler alerts and say what she's going to talk about. You're going to hear that. And I think you're going to find that very, very interesting. But I do want to do a reminder that if you did not hear part one, I strongly encourage you to listen to it, as Dr. Jackson gives great information, history, and information about Black psychology. She really sets out the fundamentals. But if you just want to start now and dive right on in, well, that's definitely your choice, and we welcome that. So let's join the conversation with Dr. Jackson, which is already in progress. Sit back and relax and join the conversation.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Dr. Jackson, was you have a certification in the complexities of racial trauma. And I'm not really exactly sure what the complexities of racial trauma are. I know there are different, forms of trauma, microaggressions, and things like that. But how does that how do you use that, in Black psychology?
Wonderful question again. First, just to clarify what we mean by trauma. Trauma is, in fact, a universal experience. Everyone will go through a point in time in their life when they're exposed to something that is deeply painful. May it be the premature death of a loved one, particularly if you are a 5-year-old child and you've lost your parent, right?
Mhm.
So trauma is a human experience. But there are multiple ways in which trauma can show up. The example I just gave is a natural one, right? That people do die. However, there are also imposed traumas where someone's been murdered, taken from you. And then there's also, so those are direct experiences of the trauma. But there's also, we call type 1, if it's really happening to you, if you're someone who's a survivor of sexual abuse, type 1 trauma. There's also type 2, where you are still impacted even though you're not the direct quote victim. So the child of a woman who's been raped may experience type 2 trauma because it can be assumed that the mother's traumatic experience of the rape and her recovery has a direct impact in how she mothers, how she is in the world. If she's struggling with her own depression around this and can't get out of bed, it has an impact on the child's growth. So it's type 1, type 2, first and foremost, to be clear for our audiences. Now I ask you to expand that further. There are multiple generations of unresolved trauma. Let's stay with the theory of rape. This young woman who's experienced rape and never went for care, yet is having strong reactions to it. May it be increased depression, which it's impacting her quality of life. May it be quick tempers and anger, which she just is having a hard time loving and allowing herself to be loved. It impacts her child. That child grows up in that atmosphere, and it impacts who they're going to be in the world and how they choose their mates and how they begin to parent if this has not been interrupted. So this is how the trauma of one generation can impact all the way down the line. A more familiar story around this is appreciating the story of our families and people who survived the Holocaust, right? We clear generations are still contending with that traumatic event. People who are coming from here in the Native Americans here in the United States, their walk of tears, all kinds. So you can have traumatic events that can happen at the individual level as well as a collective level. For myself, as a direct descendant of those Africans who were trafficked to the United States in 1619, that trauma would be the period of enslavement, the 200 plus years that generations were being dehumanized, where a white master had the right to rape and impregnate a 10-year-old child because he owned her, right? And as well as a 10-year-old boy, let's be clear about this, because he owned him. They had no rights to their own language, their own culture, even though at that period of time they could choose a mate, but that mate was not really theirs because the master had a right to break it up at any given time. So they were not humans. They were clearly no different than a cattle. And more importantly, there were laws that said that these Black bodies were cattle. They were just like the horse that you own and everything else that can be traded, bartered, beaten, raped, what have you. I say that to say that even though I did not experience that direct trauma, the messaging of that, the pain of that has moved down my generations. And to my knowledge, the American Psychological Association and no other mental health professionals in the United States created the care to help recover from the psychological, emotional, and physical woundedness of being exposed to that type of collective trauma for so many years, as well as Jim Crow. So this is the context. So we're not saying everything is, quote, about the enslavement period, but we are saying that there's much that's been unaddressed and undealt with, including the fact to grieve. And we do have some people of African ancestry who do not even recognize that they're still impacted by that trauma. They're denying it. They too will say that's over and done with, nothing to do with me. And yet they're not recognizing that somehow they may be dealing with some internalized racism and trauma. So I'm going to close by saying, so that's how the racial trauma can move within a family or within the community, if you will. But the racial trauma is still an environmental issue because it's still happening to us. I would submit that the murder of Brother Floyd, who I now say is the murder that was felt around the world, is complete evidence that racial trauma still exists. Because if you look deeply at the face of that white police officer, we're going to assume in here that he is a, quote, good father, good person, good human being. You have to ask yourself what happened in his psyche that he could do what he did to another body like that unaffected.
Right.
Evidence of racial trauma. And what I would also say is we have to shift this conversation about racial trauma from simply looking at the impact on the targeted group, the victim, and instead expand it to say, what is going on with the psyche of those who perpetuate it?
That's a very important question. And I guess, has there been any recognition of that, what's happening to the, people who, basically are responsible for all of this? I mean, there's nothing in the DSM about anything like that. Is there any other diagnostic manual that has anything like that in it?
So my disclaimer is that this is not my primary level of expertise in terms of there. I center my work mostly on trying to help us get woke, be woke, stay woke, and be proactive, as well as partnering with other allies. And my allies will say that there has always been some level of attention to this, but the academy, the fullness of the industry, the fullness of the profession has not embraced it or looked at it, because there were scholars before me and who are doing it again now who really did submit that there should be a diagnosis in the DSM for this. There are others who are more intentional now within the American Psychological Association to move this critical question to the forefront, to look at it. So again, I want to support the work of those colleagues, glad they're doing it and happy to support them in it.
So are we still passing that trauma on to our children? Is that
Absolutely. Yes.
so? What can we do, if anything, to minimize that or eliminate it altogether? Maybe we can't eliminate it, but what should we be doing?
Great question. Like any illness, and that's what this is, the first thing is to name it and to discuss it. How do we have good critical conversations that are age appropriate and family accessible around what it means for us to be Black and the ways in which we have messaged good messages to each other and ourselves or painful ones? And I'm going to give the example of the painful one. In many of our communities, we know, and excuse my language, we know we can call a child out of their name, which is already bad in of itself, to call them, you know, that B word.
Mm.
But we also know we start saying Black B, like somehow putting Black before it makes it that much more of more of a punch.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some of the ways in which we're perpetuating the storiedness that there's something wrong with being Black.
Yeah.
Right? Our challenges with colorism, our in-house, our family challenges when we are, quote, privileging this thing called good hair and light skin over darkness and kinky. Those are some of the ways in which we inadvertently collude with the madness around us to perpetuate racial trauma.
Mm.
So therefore, we must be more intentional to use our words carefully, to be intentional to lift up our children in age appropriate ways, to speak to their brilliance, to truly believe in their brilliance and love them in this, and to shore them up and to let them know that racism does exist. It doesn't mean that every situation they find themselves in or every white person they interact with is racist. No, by no means at all. But Brother Kenneth Hardy, who's a Black psychologist, reminds us that we have to pay, that there's something called a healthy sense of paranoia. Where we have to be, if I just got dissed in a line, overlooked, dismissed, or treated badly by a teller, I have to ask myself, wait, is the teller just having a bad day? Did I do something wrong about how I presented myself? Or could this be something about racism?
Mm-hmm.
Could it be something about genderism? We have to begin to, in a very quick way, foster this type of an analysis to check and see, because when we understand what's happening to us, then we can make good, clear decisions as to how we want to respond. So this can be done in an age appropriate way for our children, in teaching them, first of all, mirroring back to them the goodness of who they are. So there should be images in the house of good, positive Black images, positive Black books, along with all the other traditional books that anyone would read. It doesn't have to all be about Blackness, but it should definitely be in there, right? As
Yeah.
well as the critical conversations, the movies we choose to watch, and how we engage in conversations. The Disney movies are perfect examples. In some ways, they have been culprits in
Mm-hmm.
perpetuating negative imaging of people of color
Mm-hmm.
while we're still enjoying it. And I'm not to say we can't enjoy it, but how do you have good conversations afterwards? And I'll give a snippet of an example that comes up for me as I'm learning now to be a grandmother as to a 9-year-old, as my son has a stepdaughter, and I'm blessed in this space. But she said to me one day, we were talking, and she had talked about a little white lie. You see, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, why in this day and age is a 9-year-old talking about? I said, so baby, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of wrong, but it's not completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And remember Dr. Martin Luther King's messaging.
Yeah.
So it's obviously still happening.
Mm-hmm. So it looks like we have a lot to do in terms of our own education and educating our children, because we came up that way using terms like that, white lie
Yeah.
and the kinds of things that you're talking about now. And
Yeah.
so how do we get that? How do we, how do we sensitize ourselves to how we are sometimes our own worst enemy? And
Mhm. There are several resources and thoughts that come to mind. So thank you for that invitation. First and foremost, I want to bring to the audience's attention that we've developed something in 2012. The Association of Black Psychologists was approached by the Community Healing Network CEO, Sister Enola Aird, to develop a curriculum, if you will, that's designed to help communities, Black communities, do Black communities and reawaken their own self-healing and self-determination capacity. So we developed something called the Emotional Emancipation Circles.
Mhm.
And they have been launched all around the world. Again, because our starting point is that any person of African ancestry has been exposed to the lie of Black inferiority and the lie of white superiority. These are ways of being in the world. And so um, the emotional emancipation circles are meant to be a way that communities can kind of come together and look at some critical issues, tell their own stories, and decide for themselves how they want to be, how to recognize the lie and how to push back on it. Other examples too is since we've been in this COVID state of affairs, we have launched something called the Sao Bono Healing Circles within the Association of Black Psychologists. And with our counterparts at the Community Healing Network, we launched the Ubuntu, Ubuntu circles. And these circles are meant to be a rapid response to acute trauma and stress, like the murder of Brother Floyd, like the insurrection that happened here in the United States on January 6th, like the Haitian situation that's going on now as they're in recovery from the earthquake. These circles are meant to be open spaces for people of African ancestry to kind of come together, address the challenges they're dealing with, be able to spit some of that pain out, and to breathe and exhale and take in cultural wisdom, and again, to decide for themselves. And then I'll also say too, I want to give a shout out
Excuse me
for
1 second. Diane had just, I see she finished her espresso. Yeah.
Yes,
my
Robin and
apologies.
colleagues. I finished my espresso, and unfortunately, I have to go to another meeting. But it was so grateful. I'm so grateful I had an opportunity to talk with you, Dr. Jackson. You've been providing some incredibly, immensely important information. So I hope to be able to see you again, and I look forward to listening to the entire podcast so I can hear the entire.
Thank you, Sister Bradley.
All
It's
right.
a pleasure
Thank you
having
so
you
much.
with us.
I really
Bye.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Diane.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Have a good meeting.
Excuse me, Dr. Jackson. Yeah.
No worries, no worries. So just to close this off, Sister Lofton, in terms of what they can do, those are some tangible resources, as well as going to our website, which is www.a as in apple, B as in boy, P as in Paul, S as in Sam, I as in ink, absci.org. You'll see other resources there. There are a plethora of books that our Black scholars have written that are both professional, scholarly ones, as well as everyday folk talk in terms of speaking directly to parents and whatnot, children's books. There is also a workbook that Dr. Wade Nobles and Dr. Lawford Goddard have put together that was designed for multiple generations to engage in self-exploration around Black history during the time of COVID. Because again, we are not locked down. We are instead, how do we socially engage in the midst of a COVID and reconnect? So they created this workbook just for that, to allow for those generations to come together. And then there's always our more clearly traditional ways of being, to be clear about them. Our sister friends, sister circles, the conversations that happens in the beauty parlors, the barber shops, our religious institutions. We have to be very intentional to come back and have kitchen table conversations, to really pose these questions to one another and listen deeply as we respond, not judging one another, not saying everybody's got to be one type of Blackness, but instead, how do we increase our knowledge base about our own history to decide what we want to hold on to? Dr. Nobles has said to me many times, you need to taste it, chew it, spit out that which doesn't feel good to you, and allow yourself to be nourished accordingly with that which does fill you up.
That's amazing, and I think one of the issues is the sensitivity. Are we educated to be sensitive to some of these cultural issues that are causing us stress? and the racism that we experience. It's kind of difficult, when, especially, I guess, if it depends on your generation, but the older generations coming up just didn't have that educational sensitivity and background.
Well, see, this is where, again, this is where, as I'm learning about Black psychology, I would say we step back into our African wisdom. That's why we are a village. That's why we're each other's best medicine, because our young people are all over this. That's why I'm saying it should be multi-generational conversations. We, as someone who is aspiring one day to be a good elder, right? I'm in training for this, right? So and to be an elder in our community, as you know, is more than aging. It means that you've already proven yourself as one who protects the village. Mm-hmm. And I will be honored if and when I'm invited to be such that person. But what I'm saying, our elders protect the village, which is what they have done, and we wouldn't be here today. Right. Both in terms of the founders of ABPSI, the founders who did Black psychology, because many of those psychologists, to be very clear, took professional hits to study what they studied. They were not going to get jobs studying Black psychology or become tenured. So they took professional hits to be where we are now, that we can take for granted, that we can stand in that psychology. But what I want to say here is, we have to be intentional to listen across the generations to one another. They will teach us how to push back on and recognize the racism, where we will teach them the wisdom of where they came from. Because again, if they know who they are and whose they are, then they will fear no one, and they can make more informed decisions, so they're not reacting, but instead being proactive in their own agency.
I think that's very, very true, and it's amazing. I think back to years ago when Roots came out, and everyone started trying to connect with their families, and that was a very, very important time. And people were still doing that, having family reunions and all of that. Yes. COVID kind of changed some of that, but that was really, really important to know where you came from, or that you even had relatives in this line or anything. Where did you originate from, and how did you get to where you are? So I think that's really, really important.
Mel, one thing you were mentioning to me actually repeatedly over the years, you've said that, when you were growing up in Third Ward in Houston, under segregation, you said that there was a community around you. You knew the doctor and the pharmacist and the pastor and people next door, and you really felt that there was a level of support, and there was real community there. There were people to talk to. There was a protection, almost a border. That was kind of a legally imposed one, which I don't necessarily agree with. But I do see how, that was when I have friends around that I can explain, well, this happened, and I don't have to explain why this was a bad thing, that, okay, it could have been 100 other things, but I think it was this, and I don't have to explain that. There is something that kind of diffuses its power over me. And I think that maybe in your community, you were saying the same thing when you're growing up.
Right. Well, that's true. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries. This is a beautiful conversation. I apologize for interrupting, but I also want to add at this point, because as someone who's been working in trauma, I want to say this. It's important to note too, that a number of our people who are in pain right now, which are in pain because of their experiences with family. So I want to honor that. And I still want to expand it too, in a sense that reminding us that family can be more than legal, biological relatedness. So to the listeners who are in Black communities where their pain was the source of their families, I want to say to you, first, I'm sorry that happened for you and your family. Whatever got in the way of your family loving you the way they wanted to and should have, I also wonder how much of that too is this unresolved trauma I spoke about before. But to support you, I do want to invite you to be intentional in recreating family-like relationships, being that family for someone else and letting them be family for you, as you together collectively begin to look at African Black history and decide what's meaningful for you and what you want to move forward in your own life. I just want to add that to the story, because right now we were focusing on when things go good, and I want to make sure we recognize that not everyone's going to find themselves in such a immediate loving village.
Right.
Well, that's true. And I remember when I was growing up, I hate to, to age myself, but anyway, when I was growing up, we had your mother, but you also had your play mother and your
Yes.
play aunt and your
Yes.
play brother, so you had all kinds of people around you for support, people you were not necessarily related to, but who were there when you need them. My teachers just lived down the street from me, the teachers in my school. And that just doesn't necessarily happen today. But you're right. It takes a village, and we have to make sure that the village doesn't have to be next door, but it could be, wherever we are, and we have a responsibility. I'm a grandmother too, and so I have a responsibility to my grandson to bring him along and to explain
Yes.
some things to him. So one of the things to get back to some of the racial issues, one of the things that people have struggled with, Black people in particular, is um, many times we are misdiagnosed. Uh, and that puts us into systems that we shouldn't be in, like sometimes the prison system, or it could be we could be expelled from school. You mentioned, a person who was expelled from school for whatever. But this misdiagnosis, if we go to a psychologist, should we look for any particular type of psychologist? How do we know that when we go to someone, we won't be misdiagnosed and put into some kind of system or on medications that we shouldn't be on?
Okay, thank you for that question. So I take a deep breath to kind of help settle my spirit as I continue to lean into this with you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, I would ask family to, first of all, be clear about why you're seeking services, because that will help, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're clear about what you're trying to do and you're able to articulate that, even if you're stumbling through it, doesn't have to be perfect, but I do want you to begin to think about, if this therapy was really going to be helpful for me, how will I know it? What is it that I want help with, right? Because if you're able to articulate that, it may help give some insight as to discerning the right person for you. Of course, the second real issue is the compensation. Our insurance can either open doors or limit doors,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just to be very clear, as I always say, you get what you pay for. So,
Very true.
okay. And so sometimes it may need to be out of pocket, and that's not always accessible for folks. Also, I would say that when you're ready to meet with a mental health practitioner, they should be able to give you some time that's uncharged just to meet with them.
Mm-hmm.
If it's 15 minutes, whatever that may be. And you want to first see what it feels like to be with them,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of our best protectors as African folk, when we are reminded that we are spirit beings having a human experience,
Mm-hmm.
is that we can come across someone, and before they open their mouth, we can feel like if this is going to be a trusting conversation or not.
Mm-hmm.
Sure can.
If anything, that may be something that we've been distanced from, is our ability to do that, right? So I want to put that out here. And then, of course, there's critical conversations about, you can be very clear to ask them things like, can you explain to me, what's been your experience working with folks like me? You fill in that blank, whatever you want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
I also invite the listeners to be curious about asking the question for yourself and with that mental health provider. What, if anything, does being exposed to racial trauma have to do with whatever discomfort that you're dealing with? Because that's an unasked and unanswered question, both for us individually and for us in relationship with our therapist or our provider. So if the provider can engage you in this level of conversation, that's already a sign that this may be a good starting place.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I want to remind us again that we are each other's best medicine. Not everything that is therapy is therapeutic for us. And not everything that is therapeutic is therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, like anything else, we'll be good consumers of these resources. They're not doing us a favor. They're here to help serve us. So you want to make sure you're getting the best partner in your own healthcare as possible. If they're able to talk with you about the diagnosis and even listen to you for your own feedback, make sure you understand that quote diagnosis, if you agree with it or not. If they can tolerate all of that, then that's a good sign. Sometimes you might be in a setting where those conversations are not welcomed.
Yeah.
Again, not for me to judge what's better or for worse, but I want to answer the question that Sister Lofton put to me about how my people, how people of African ancestry, but true for anyone, but definitely those of African ancestry, can decide if this is the right mental health setting for them. And then also be intentional about, there could be things that you can just do in your life that's going to help you be psychologically, emotionally well-being. Paying attention to our diet, the nutrition, you are what you eat, right? There's a lot of foods that we take in, these fatty fast foods and everything else that can not only add to the weight, but add to our tendency for depression-like symptoms, the headaches we might get, difficulties moving in the morning. You know, so looking at our nutrition, looking at of course, our exercise, and more specifically, looking at our involvement in the community. Again, we're each other's best medicine. If I'm struggling, like when I came onto this call, I want to share this. When I came onto the call, I had mentioned to you that I was already sort of dealing with some stressors that were hanging heavy on my spirit. And you've done just what I thought would happen. My being engaged in this conversation with you, I hope will be beneficial for the listeners, but more specifically, it's been beneficial for me to remind me of who I am, whose I am. And the questions that were posed, particularly from Sister Bradley and each of you, has loved me back into my righteous mind again in spirit. And I want to thank you for that. So I'm saying you're modeling what I mean by we can be each other's good therapy as well.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think that's really important. I mean, that's a power that we have, that's just there. Like you say, we're spiritual beings, and we know when we connect, and how we interact with each other is just so important. That we're our own village, wherever we are, and however remote we might be. So that's amazing.
So so we want to ask the question, how are you? And then deeply listen as we share.
Okay.
That's an amazing approach. Listen. That's something that we don't do, I think, often enough to each other. We pass by, but we don't listen.
I mean, one thing I find too is that meditation is something that's really helpful for me, and I find that helps me to listen inwardly, to feel, to hear what my body is saying, what my spirit is saying, what my psyche, what my breath is saying, all of that, and somehow, because I want to get lazy and say, well, I'll skip the meditation for today, but then I said, no problem, just go ahead and do even 5 minutes, and somehow things get back into place, so they just become more revealed, or I'm just able to manage them better. And I wonder, is meditation, and particularly mindfulness meditation, but I guess any kind, is that something that a woke kind of a psychologist would accept, or is this now kind of crossed over into the mainstream anyway?
Great question again. So practices like meditation and yoga and contemplative approaches to care, self-care and collective care are definitely very helpful. And I find it interesting now that they're much more, quote, mainstreamed and commercialized as part of care, when, to be very clear, if we understand our histories, many African indigenous peoples had already practiced yoga and some form of meditation. However, these things were not, quote, scientifically proven and valued in the professional world where they are now. And yet I find that sometimes when we are trying to introduce mindfulness in certain Black communities, particularly certain faith communities, they have a hard time receiving it. And so I submit that that's an example of the internalized oppression, that we no longer recognize that which was already ours. And it's also how it's being presented to us. For the listeners, for me at least, the way I think about this, what comes up for me is looking at the hieroglyphics, the images along the pyramids, the different contortionist positioning that we found those Black bodies to be in. Please help me understand that's not yoga.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, okay, just help me understand that, right?
Definitely, yeah.
And I stand corrected if I'm misspeaking, but my babas, my nanas, my scholar warriors before me have taught me this. And my apologies, I have the I know you'll be hopefully be able to cut that part out, but I'll trust that you'll. My apologies for the background music. But anyway, the other part of this too is, so mindfulness, first and foremost, colleagues, goes well beyond Buddha.
Okay.
Okay, got to go a little deeper, because if we truly understand that all of life began on the continent and it's just a matter of which way you got up and walked, then where did Buddha get it from?
All right.
Okay, so yes, the mindfulness, yoga, all of that is very helpful, very important. What I would invite our listeners to do, though, is to ask themselves, how can these tools also increase their sense of self as a person of African ancestry, to engage them further in deciding what might be meaningful for them or not? Case in point, we talk about yoga, but there's also a form that I'm learning more about now called Kemet yoga, which is yoga that's inspired by our Egyptian African-ness, if you will. If we're doing meditation, I would respectfully say that many of us do not have the luxury to empty our minds in a contemplative state of space and being. We should be very intentional to say, how do I reflect on either an African proverb or a quote or something I remember my mama or my papa's telling me that made me feel good? How do I meditate on that for its deep meaning for me now? Because it could be one of the protective factors when I'm faced with some microaggression or racial trauma that can help me respond in my righteous mind, as Denzel Washington's character said in the debate. Help me find, reclaim, and retain my righteous mind.
Right.
Versus being reactive.
Right. That's just amazing to go back to, your kind of where you were taught, and use some of that. I mean, there's lots there, and I think that some of us have forgotten, how rich it was. We just moved on because it's always, get the modern thing, not, the ancestral thing, and that's where the beauty is, and that's where the joy and the peace, I think, reside.
Exactly. It reminds me, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who will always be mama to me because she raised me, never went beyond the 8th grade. But when I was thinking about whether or not I was going to go off to graduate school, and again, my being among the first to go to college, she would say to me, baby, learn their words and use their words. Little did I know what she meant by that until now in this part of my life. What I hear her saying is, get the education and then critically use that education to take things further, to see where its strengths are, where its limitations are, and move it forward. And that's what I'm doing in this space. So she was very wise to say that.
That's very wise. I remember, when I was growing up, I mean, there was no question that, we would go to college. I mean, you had your choice. You could either, I came up in Texas, of course, you could either be a domestic worker, house worker, or you could go to college. Those are your two choices. And you make that choice when you were 2 years old. And that's it. And that's the line that you were on. So, yeah, it's parents, basically put that in front of you. That's, they pull you through that and support you in that. So that was really, really something.
Well, I really honestly like the way that you're approaching this through, stepping into our health and wellness rather than, looking for the problem, seeking out a pathology or something we need to correct or to medicate, or something that's a problem. And I really like the approach of thinking, how can we, step into and stay in our health and our wellness. And I think, yeah, for me, I said meditation is one of them, but I really like the other ideas that you said too. Really work. And community, I think, is something that, living in Belgium has been very difficult for me to find a community. I mean, I have the basic community where my son was in school and all of that, but there were people that were nice and friendly, and we ate dinner together, but there wasn't the connection. And I find my son, who has now gone off to college, and he's saying he's found a circle of African American students, and he said, you know what, they get it. I I don't have to explain it and then just have them roll their eyes.
Yes,
Right,
that's recreating a family right there. Yes, we are a village, and let the circle be unbroken. Absolutely, but we have to be very intentional to recreate those villages each time.
Recreate the villages.
Yeah.
I have a quote that it's maybe a little bit off of this immediate topic, but it's one that you said, and I just have to ask you about it. Okay, it is, every institution in America is born from the blood of.
Okay.
Coming. I gotta read it for the listeners.
Okay.
The blood of white supremacist ideology and capitalism, and that's the disease. And I was thinking, okay, I know Sherman James, who was talking about John Henryism, was saying, we're not the problem. It's systemic racism, it's structural racism that's the problem.
Yeah.
And other people are saying, no, it's racism, but somehow, I don't know, we've kind of felt like we're the problem. I got to ask you, so what do you say?
Okay, thank you for choosing that quote. It's a quote that has positioned me for targeting in lots of different ways, which I'm not surprised and was initially afraid until, again, I leaned back into my own circle of support, because it does show, just like with any other folks, when you start speaking truth to power, you got to be ready for some response. Right?
Oh, but I'm sorry. Wow.
Right? No, it's Sister Lofton, please don't be sorry. Instead, be inspired, be affirmed, be clear. Right? Okay. That's what I ask of the listener. So for me, for that comment, it is literally a waste of time to debate whether or not an individual is racist. For me, I have no interest in it, no value in it, because that is a distraction from the real issue. The real issue is that there are structures that are built on racist ideologies. And I submit to you, law enforcement, healthcare, legal system, almost any industry you go into, education, its ground foundational roots still bears some residuals of structural racism. Again, locating to my own culturalness as someone, as an African American here in America. Just think about the conflict and the irony here, that good white Americans fought for freedom, created a whole constitution of equal rights, while at the same time annihilating a whole race of Native Americans who are already here first, and legalizing the owning of a Black body.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you please pay attention to the irony of all of that?
Yeah.
And the industry of psychology and everything else was born from that. So just because those four parents did not have consciously in their radar, I'm trying to make equal rights only for me and not anyone else, doesn't mean that that's still not spinning through the dialogue. So I consider it the poisonous well. And it doesn't mean it poisons everyone, because we all have different constitutions, right? We can be exposed to the same level of poison, but not have the same response to it. And also we can have access to good, healthy resources to counter the poison. So what I'm saying here is, We have to do a critical examination of our industries, of our professions, to see where the residuals of that type of thinking still lies and how we can, quote, root it out and make the changes we need to make in our systems so they are, in fact, meeting their genuine intentions and missions. And this is what now I'm not giving a, let me say it differently here. This is what some industries are embracing. So right now it appears that the American Psychological Association is attempting to do just that, to do a self-examination. I'm choosing my words carefully because the history books will bear out how effective and genuine they really are.
Right.
Okay, just to be clear, because if you do this work correctly, as we all know, if we do a good self-examination, we must transform. So if nothing transforms,
Then,
so
okay.
this is what I mean, that these, in a concrete example of this might be when we think about the revolution that came for our able-bodied members, right? When we became very clear that, let me back up and give a personal example here. I do not have any physical disabilities. When I became a parent, and because of my social economic status, I did like everyone else. I got Cadillacs for strollers. Okay, so I remember going to the mall, and the door opened towards me, which made it extremely difficult to maneuver getting my Cadillac stroller through. So all of a sudden, I'm going, wow, this is what people mean who are living with mobility challenges. And oh, see, again, so we would not have known that had that legal voice been raised and pushed to make things accessible. So now mothers with their Cadillacs can benefit because there is a button there that you can push to have that door open for you. Right? So this is the same thing. If we want to really do anti-racism, then we must first look deeply in the roots of our industries, our disciplines, to see where it's still impacting so we can unpack it, because otherwise we're still socializing good people into the poison medicine. Okay. They come in wanting to help, but because of the limitations of what we think we know, we actually end up setting them up to do either no help, at minimal, at worst, do harm. And that was my experience being trained as a clinical psychologist in the field, where I was being taught how to be with people who looked like me that I knew was not healthy and not right. But I was powerless to respectfully share that back with the authorities who were writing the books and telling me how to be with Black folks.
Wow.
But otherwise, you would not have gotten through the course. I mean, that's
exactly
just, it's the system.
Well, and actually, yeah. So to your point, Elder Lofton, this was from your generation and previous ones to mine, where we were always told, keep your head down and just get through.
Get through.
And we had to do that to get on the other side. But I want to say to our next generation, they're not keeping their heads down. Because because the discipline and the science of Black psychology exists, they have everything they need to stand on top of and keep their heads up. Because they can say, excuse me, what textbook is that coming from? Because this textbook says this, and we need to have that textbook in this course. Why can't we look at the science that's coming out of Black psychology? If I'm looking at human development, then I want to see the writings of Nancy Boyd Franklin, of Naeem Akbar, of Kobe Kamban and others, along with these European theorists. I want them all here. So our next generation gets to demand that in their educational experience.
Yeah, because in my generation, we didn't have the tools or the information to even demand.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And what we have to do, I think, is to support them in demanding that and not
Absolutely.
pull them back. I think some of us might pull them back and say, no, no, stay in your lane here. But I think we need to support them.
Well, all I can say is that if the Black millennials around the world, anything like the Black millennials I've met here in the United States, we're in good hands, okay? Because they're not turning back, and we want them to continue to protest in their righteous mind, not
Right.
in a rioted mind,
Right.
right?
Right.
And they have a power and authority. If they are paying, if they're getting these loans to get their degrees in these graduate programs, then they have a right to see the writings from people who look like them in their course material to be examined and critiqued like anything else.
Right.
And if they have challenges with that, we now do have a stronger legal system to support them. And let me also say, too, they can also reach out to the local chapter, at least here in the United States, the local chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. And no matter where you are in the globe, you can reach out, because if we can't help you, we'll help put you in contact with somebody who can, because there are Black scholars around the world who are in a better position to support the next generation in getting these critical conversations into the course.
Very, very important. Very critical. Very important.
But I think I agree we have to do more to support them too, because
Yes.
oftentimes, I mean, it looks like they're standing out there alone. The media, paints them in a bad way as being, thugs or, into some bad way that makes people not want to support them. And we have to see through that, make sure that we're there for them. And that, yeah. But one thing I do want to do, because I'm almost finished with my espresso, but before I do that, uh, I have brought up meditation a couple of times, and I just wondered if you have something up your sleeve that you can share with us, meditative wise.
That would be great.
Okay, that is beautiful. What I'm going to do at this moment as well is to invite the listeners from your vantage point in however way you define yourself culturally, specifically to those who identify of African ancestry, but I want to be mindful there may be other ethnic groups in the listening audience as well. I want to invite you to take a moment to intentionally look up in your social media devices a proverb that's meaningful for you. So you may look up, if you do a quick search on the internet for African proverbs, Italian proverbs, Asian proverbs, whatever feels meaningful. Or your other option might be is to take a moment and reflect on a saying that you remember from your childhood, a loving comments from someone within your family. I mentioned earlier the example of my grandmother who would say, baby, learn their words and use their words. So again, take a moment, find a meaningful ethnic proverb, or identify some meaningful comments from your childhood that came to you with love. I'll give you a moment to locate that.
Should we share that with you?
No, I want you to hold on to it for yourselves. It's a gift for yourself. I do want you to keep the image open. Okay. We'll take about another 30 seconds. Okay. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to try to share this musical background with you. So I want to test the sound first, if I might. But again, this is giving the listeners a little bit more time to find their proverb or write out the loving comments that they remember from their loved one? Okay, good. I'm going to play in the background some music. It's called African Journey and the Healing Drum. Again, for the listeners, called African Journey and the Healing Drum. I am simply pulling this from YouTube.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So as you are first finding a comfortable body position, I do ask, if at all possible, to have your feet grounded on solid ground. Ideally, it would be great if you were able to be directly connected with Mother Earth in terms of feeling the dirt under your feet in the grass. But again, you want to be solid ground. I also invite the listener to be in what we call an open position, meaning as you're seated, please do not have your legs crossed, your arms crossed, because you want to be open to be able to receive whatever you're meant to receive in this meditation experience. Yes, you can have your eyes open or closed. However, I have invited you to meditate on specific words in terms of the African proverb or the quotes. So I do want you to take that in. I'm also going to invite you to breathe deeply, meaning you be intentional to breathe in through your nose, typically for a count of 2, and exhale, typically for a count of 4. The most important thing is, as we engage in this exercise, I want you to really be fully involved and engaged with your own body. Be aware of the words in front of you. And be clear to accept the music in the background. Take this moment to breathe deeply. Exhale fully. Take in the words that you've chosen for yourself. Reflect on their meanings to you. Why these words? While breathing in deeply, exhaling deeply. Now I ask you to allow yourself to feel the words that you chose. Breathing in deeply. Exhaling fully. Feel the fullness of the words, the deepness of the music, the power of your breath. Breathing in fully. Exhaling fully. I'm going to quiet my words for 1 full minute to allow you to deeply embrace the words you chose, the feltness of those words, the gift of the music, the fullness of your body. As you breathe in fully and exhale fully, Enjoy the next minute fully, solely for yourself. Love who you are. Know who you are and whose you are. And stay strong in the fullness of your culturalness. Taking a few moments to finish that as you need to. Loving your Blackness. Embracing your Blackness. Embracing your humanity. For listeners, identify otherwise, love your cultureness. Embrace your culturalness. And love your humanity. Thank you for this opportunity. Ashe. And I turn it back over to you, my dear sister, Robin Lofton.
Thank you so much, everybody. Sorry Diane wasn't here, but she's here with us in spirit. Thank you so much, sisters, mother, for sharing this space with us in this time and this bringing this energy to this space. It was just beautiful.
It was a blessing for me as well. So I want to say thank you. As I continue to try to reclaim my own natural tongue, I want to say Asante Sana for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think we'll close from here. Ashe.
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 Thank you for listening to this episode of Espresso Talk today. We begin by thanking Dr. Theopia Jackson for generously sharing her time and insights about Black-centered psychology, or Black psychology. As you can see, Black psychology is a complex and Black culture-based form of psychology. It is not simply having a Black therapist. In this episode, Dr. Jackson extensively discussed trauma as a human experience. She also talked about a healthy sense of paranoia that is found in Black people, but has also been pathologized in Western psychology. Lastly, Dr. Jackson ended with a powerful meditation, which incorporated African spirituality, ancestral wisdom, and healing drum music. This meditation is also available as a separate podcast show on the Espresso Talk Today website or wherever you listen to a podcast. Again, we want to thank Dr. Theopia Jackson for her work and commitment to Black psychology and for sharing her insights with us. And if you want more information about Black psychology, please visit their website at abpsi.org or the Espresso Talk Today website at espressotalktoday.com, where you'll find helpful resources. You can also find us on Facebook at the Espresso Talk Today podcast page and Instagram at Espresso Talk Today. And if you enjoyed this podcast show, please tell your friends about Espresso Talk Today. They just might enjoy this podcast too. Everyone is welcome in this community. And remember, you can always contact us at team@espressotalktoday.com. expressotalktoday.com. We love reading your thoughts, questions, and ideas about our uncommon conversation. We look forward to having you back with us next week. Ciao!